Everyone, welcome to your first lecture of the Age of Exploration. This is part one of two specifically of the Age of Exploration. We'll have other discussions on things that happened as a result of the Age of Exploration, but it's important to note that we're going to do this lecture from two different points of view because depending on the point of view, this sounded like a great, glorious time, which promoted tons of innovation and growth and wealth. But then from the other point of view, the non-European point of view, this was a time of kind of chaos and destruction and not many benefits. But we'll get to that in another lecture. So first of all, here today, the European point of view. The causes, you don't need to write this down because we're going to break down each one on its own slide. The causes of the Age of Exploration can be summarized in three words: gold, God, and glory. And so this is kind of the overview of where we're headed. And so if you can remember those three and understand what they mean, you're well on your way to understanding the entire Age of Exploration. So the first one is gold. When I say gold, I'm more referring to wealth of any kind. There was a huge interest in obtaining wealth and goods like spices and silk and things that were considered luxurious. And this kind of was a result of the Crusades and Europeans traveling to new areas and seeing what else was out there. It was a result of hearing about some of these luxury items from Marco Polo's travels and Ibn Battuta's travels. And it was a result of this new method of economic policy, or this new mentality of economic policy, that having more wealth than any other kingdoms made you more powerful. And that there was this finite amount of wealth and you could always have more than someone else. And it's not even good enough that you're equal in wealth to another kingdom. You must have more. And so that's the idea of mercantilism. So kind of connected to that idea of a merchant who is trying to buy and sell goods to make a lot of money. This was now done at the kingdom's level to have the kingdom with the most wealth. This also relates to the fact that the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East was starting to dominate trade, and this was causing products to become more and more expensive. You can see on the bottom here, the Ottoman Empire over about 200 years was getting larger and larger after they had taken over from the Byzantine Empire, and they were controlling trade. Don't worry, I'll put the words back up in just a second. They were controlling trade because, remember, the Middle East is considered the crossroads of trade. And so a product that, specifically spices in the case of my map here, as spices were sold in the area of the world that they were very common, they were pretty cheap. But then as they traveled across land, those spices, as they were bought and sold between merchants, were getting more and more and more expensive, especially by the time they hit Europe. And so the Europeans were looking to cut out the middlemen. So in many cases, the Muslims, who they also didn't trust after hundreds of years of fighting in the Crusades. And so if they could find a way to avoid trading across land and use the oceans, they could then cut out all of those merchants in between and keep goods cheaper and avoid dealing with people that they didn't trust. Europeans also wanted to spread Christianity, specifically Catholicism, because it was believed that that was the only true religion and that the entire world would be better off if everyone believed the same thing. This was especially pushed after the Reformation by missionaries who were trying to push the Counter-Reformation. We already know from our previous studies that the Jesuits specifically set out to spread Catholicism around the world to strengthen itself after Martin Luther kind of shook up religion as they knew it. This was also promoted, this idea of spreading Christianity was also promoted by absolute monarchs who believed that their divine right gave them power. So in other words, God gave them power to not only control their empire, but to spread his message across the world. And all of these causes kind of boil down to this sense of glory. So you could really say gold plus God as causes equal the overall most important cause of glory. Glory in the sense of having the most wealth, control, power, to make yourself look like the most important absolute monarch and the most powerful absolute monarch specifically because other absolute monarchs were popping up across Europe as well. So at this point, we have absolute monarchs in Spain, France, Portugal, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and each one wanted to be the strongest and best, and you guessed it, the most powerful. And so I've got a list here, but they all play into each other. So let me read them, and then I'll kind of connect some of the dots. These monarchs wanted territory for natural resources. They wanted to develop large armies and then use these large armies. They wanted to expand their trade markets and get more imports, so more goods coming in that weren't already easily developed in Europe, like spices and silk. And then they also wanted to expand exports, so get more customers for the things that they had to make more money that way. And so by having more territory, they had more customers. By having more natural resources, they could develop more products. They could gain these things by using these large armies that they had developed. And then they could even force their way into new markets to try to acquire more imports at a cheaper rate and acquire more customers to sell to. And so all of these things overlap one another, one another, but they all equal more power, stronger power, showing off existing power. Though those were the motivations, the reason Europeans were able to explore more in the early 1400s was because of better technology. And this is all technology that really comes from the Chinese, and it comes from the Muslim explorers and inventors, but the Europeans took it, modified it for their own purposes, and in some cases improved it for their own purposes to be able to sail to regions they had never dared to sail to before. So the printing press allowed the development and consistent spread of nautical maps. So it's one thing to have maps of land masses that many people had traveled over before, but now they were starting to develop maps of the oceans and other waterways. And so explorers could almost share their knowledge of places that they had explored with other explorers and other sailors. So nautical maps were being developed, improved, and because of the printing press, they were able to be traded or shared amongst other explorers. Gunpowder was becoming more prevalent, which allowed fighting from a distance. So instead of having to go up to your enemy and stab them with a sword, you could maybe fire a cannon from a ship, or between ship to ship, or fight from a ship to land to kind of force your way onto that land, and then overpower other civilizations that maybe didn't have access to gunpowder. So this is going to be a huge influence on the rest of civilization really to come. Astrolabes, compasses, and some other tools helped improve accuracy in travels, especially across oceans where you didn't necessarily have land markers to help gauge where you were. The caravel is a special type of ship we see down at the bottom here, and it had bilge pump systems. And because of this, these ships were faster and more maneuverable. So what a bilge pump does is it keeps water out of the bottom of a boat. So this ship can actually sail kind of higher and sail into shallower waters. And so it can transition from the deep ocean, get to land, or get closer to land, maybe even go from the ocean into a river and not have to worry about running aground. It also had different types of sails that allowed it to maneuver through the wind better than ever. Now that we've figured out the why and the how for exploration, let's talk about the who and the where. And it really begins with Portugal. Let's take a look on a map. Portugal is a small country on the Iberian Peninsula, which is this part of Europe. So there's Portugal, there's Spain, then a little bit of France before you get into the major landmass of Europe. And at this point, all we've really learned about this part of the world is that the Muslims from the Middle East had kind of worked their way, getting territory across northern Africa and even into this part of Europe. Well, Portugal, let me go back, was a small empire looking to grow. They had just teamed up with Spain to an extent and had just got done fighting to remove, if you will, Muslims and Jews living in that area. And so they had started to develop some power, and they were looking to grow. And that location that I just pointed out on the map kind of set it up to be the leaders of exploration. Sailing was already part of their culture because being such a small country just on the edge of that landmass, they really had coastline to their advantage, and that was it. They did not have a lot of natural resources because Spain was the dominant mass in that area. They did not have easy access to the Mediterranean for trading with Italy and Greece and part of the Middle East. They were pretty bound. Let's see if we can look one more time. They were pretty bound to just this area. And so you can see the blue line where the Portuguese explorers really made their mark. They explored all along the African coast, and eventually you're going to see in just a moment how they're the ones that made it also across the Indian Ocean. Another thing in Portugal's favor was that they had a leader, a monarch, who truly believed in the benefits of ocean exploration. And this was Prince Henry of Portugal. His nickname in history is Henry the Navigator, and he was a patron of sailors. So just like we learned about in art and architecture, music, playwrights, and things like that of the Renaissance, a patron is someone who helps finance other people to do their job. And so Prince Henry had a personal interest and personal goal in exploring Africa in order to find people to convert to Christianity, to find access to gold and silver, to find access to spices. And some of the stories of Mansa Musa and other travelers had made the Europeans believe that West Africa specifically was the place where they could do all of this. And so he financed voyages, he financed ships, he financed a navigation institute to make sure the people coming out of Portugal were the leading experts in sailing and had the best of the best tools and ships and maps and all of these things needed to be big-time explorers. What's interesting is he himself never actually was involved in a voyage of discovery. So he never set sail and discovered anything new. He just basically was the money behind these ventures. But two famous explorers that did come out of Portugal include Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama. So Bartholomew Diaz was known because he was the first, or is known to this day, because he was the first European to round Africa. But then he turned around and came back to report back to the king. So let's take a look at his route. He left Portugal, he skirted along Western Africa, fulfilling much of what Prince Henry set out to do, and realized around the south of Africa that he had achieved something great and discovered access to the Indian Ocean. And then he came back to tell the king all about it. At this point, this area of Africa was known as the Cape of Storms because of the rough weather in this part of the world. But King John II renamed it the Cape of Good Hope because it gave him hope that Portugal had actually found a new route to the Spice Islands, which we'll see is like the Philippines and Indonesia, where they could avoid, or they could go there while avoiding the Ottoman Empire. Vasco da Gama, on the other hand, was the first European to sail south of Africa, so the same as Diaz, but then continue on and go all the way to India. So his route, again, starting off in Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal, coming all the way around south of Africa. You can see he took quite the journey to get there, south of Africa, and then actually made it all the way to India, and then returned back. He took several routes. I want to say he took 4 trips there and back. Although this map makes me just think 2. So anyways, these voyages were extremely profitable. In fact, let me give you a little statistics. Once he got to India, he paid 6 cents per pound of a spice. Think like cinnamon, nutmeg, that sort of thing. But by the time he brought it back to Europe, he was able to resell it for about $6 a pound, which is about a 3,000% profit. That's huge. These voyages were very profitable, and so the monarchs in charge immediately said, go back, do it again. And so that's why these explorers were able to go back and forth over and over and over as they kept getting funding from their monarchs. And eventually this allowed the Portuguese Empire to actually spread all the way to Asia because they captured cities created them to be their own trading ports, and they used gunpowder to do it. So it's not like they negotiated a treaty. They forced their way into these cities, took over violently, but built their own empire that way. And now we get to one of the most famous explorers of all time, of all countries, of all points of view, and that is Christopher Columbus. You're going to decide for yourself whether or not he is or he deserves that title, but let's just go through some basics. His goal was to reach the East Indies, think like the Philippines, Indonesia, just south of China and Japan, where all these luxury items like spices and silks came from. And he wanted to get to those East Indies, but he thought he could do it by sailing west. So he had a clear idea that the world was round and thought, I don't need to keep going south of Africa to get there. I bet you there's a way that if I go west, I will get there maybe even faster. He was actually an Italian sailor, but he went to Portugal first and said, hey, King of Portugal, I would like to sail for you. And they thought his idea was going to be way too expensive, because he grossly underestimated, in their minds, he grossly underestimated how long the voyage was going to take, and it was going to be an expensive disaster. So they said no. Columbus then brought his plan to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, and worked on them until he had convinced them that this was a good idea. He actually worked on them for like 7 years until they agreed. They were kind of competing with Portugal at the time. They had become rivals at this point. And so they saw this as an opportunity to maybe overtake Portugal as the most important explorers in the world. He set sail in 1492, and he actually reached the Bahamas, the Caribbean, in about 10 weeks. So it took him about 10 weeks to sail there. He had 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and he was the captain of the Santa Maria, I believed. And once he landed in the Caribbean, he actually thought he was in Asia. And we probably know the story that he thought he had reached the Indies, and so he called the natives Indians. Which brings me to a somewhat minor explorer, and that is Amerigo Vespucci. He was an Italian explorer, and he discovered the same land as Columbus, but he is the one who realized, no, this is a new world. This is new for Europeans. Europeans never knew that this land was here. This is not the Indies like Columbus thought. And through a series of events that aren't super important for our purposes, that is why the Americas are named the Americas. So North America and South America, because of Amerigo Vespucci, not because of Columbus, because there's no actual connection to the name America and Columbus. And now to our last explorer. We're almost done. We have one more slide after this one, but our last explorer of note is Magellan. He was another explorer funded by Spain to reach Asia going west. So he had that in common with Columbus. And the reason he's famous is he led the first voyage to circumnavigate the earth. In other words, the voyage to go completely all the way around the globe. One thing to note is he actually, instead of just going across the Atlantic to the Caribbean like Columbus and Vespucci did, he actually then went south and went under South America to an area now known as the Straits of Magellan. But this was a rough journey. Of 5 ships and 237 crew members, only 1 ship made it all the way back to Spain with 18 men on it. In fact, Magellan himself didn't actually make it back. When they did stop in the Philippines, the East Indies that all the Europeans were trying to get to, Magellan got killed in some local battles. One of the most important takeaways here is that going forward, everything in history is now done at the global scale. So transportation can happen at the global scale. Exchange of goods and services could happen at the global scale. Settlements could happen at the global scale, and more. And to finally wrap this one up, it's important to realize, and hopefully you do realize after hearing all of these stories, that Portugal and Spain were the 2 leaders in the age of exploration, and they both made important gains. But this also led to a fierce rivalry between the 2. And they disputed who had a right to whatever territory was discovered. Never mind the fact that indigenous people already lived there. We'll talk about that eventually. But they fought over whose land would be who would have claim to the natural resources and the trading ports and all of that. So being both strong Catholic nations, they decided to go to the Pope to settle their differences, and the Pope drew a line of demarcation, which basically is this purple line. And what the Pope said was that Spain would have all of the territory to the west of this line, and Portugal would have all the territory to the east of this line. Again, never mind the fact that they don't really have a right to any of this land, other than the Pope said so. And this not only caused a lot of conflict with the indigenous people, but it also spurred other European nations to build their own trading empires, because they're like, whoa, why do Spain and Portugal get to just divide the world in half? That's not fair. Portugal did get the Spice Islands in the East Indies, which was what they thought was a huge advantage, because that's what really set off on the Age of Exploration in general. But what they didn't realize, because they did not quite understand the world as a whole yet, is that the area that they were allowed to explore was actually a lot smaller than Spain's. So that's it. Thanks for sticking with me on such a doozy of a topic. There's a lot more to come. So interesting topic to explore.